Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to June on the Range, a new inaugural BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan that has its first year this year in 2022, in which myself and Michael K. Vaughan and a bunch of other great co-hosts are reading Westerns throughout the month of June. Once the Crown, the ruler of all genre fiction Westerns were, and they aren't anymore, and they aren't coming back, I don't think, unless there's some sort of revival that I don't anticipate. There are too many problematic, as the Twitter people would say, elements to Westerns, I think, to ever really bring them back. Almost every element of traditional Westerns would now be considered by the blue check marks on Twitter to be problematic. Too many times problems are solved by violence. Westerns are animated by an awareness of right and wrong, good people and bad people, upright, honorable behavior, and despicable criminal behavior. That distinction is enough to make you lose your job in the 21st century. You're not allowed to make that distinction. In the 21st century, two wrongs make a right, and anything you can do to someone that you don't like is right. So that whole attitude in a traditional Western is out the window. Of course, there's the treatment and consideration of all of the Native American tribes of North America, all of whom are the villains, usually in traditional Westerns, and they can't be. In the 21st century, it's pretty tough to characterize people as being villains if you are the ones dispossessing them of their lands. And none of that is to say anything about the sexism in traditional Westerns. So I don't see these things making a comeback. They would have to adapt or die, as the saying goes. But it's been a huge amount of fun to read these things anyway. There's an endless profusion of them out there. And one of the things that I read yesterday, last night, or the night before last, was a Western-themed romance. Because the romance genre for a long time, the romance as a genre is everything. If you watch Sarah, the Bookish Knitter, she makes this point all the time, that romance as a genre has everything in it. It has mystery. It has intrigue, it has the paranormal, it has science fiction, it has Westerns. And for the longest time, the Westerns in the romance genre were booming, but in ways that aren't allowable anymore. You know, where a prim and proper New England schoolteacher is ravished into womanhood by an Apache brave who is portrayed as barely better than some sort of Cro-Magnon knuckle-dragger. Or worse, or elements worse than that. So there were authors who wrote dozens and dozens of books along those lines that will never be reprinted, of course, but their equivalent is not written today. And you can see what. When you go back and look at them, maybe read some of them, you go to a used bookstore that specializes in old romances, you'll find billions of these things. They don't exist anymore. No one does that anymore. No one writes Comanche Moon romances anymore. But cowboys have survived. Usually not in the setting of the traditional Western, which is somewhere between the California Gold Rush in the 1840s and the end of the Victorian era, the end of Victoria's reign, the beginning of the modern world, the so-called modern world. When you are writing in 1910, if you're setting a novel in 1910 is the end of King Edward's reign, and it's within spitting distance of the beginning of World War I. So you can't have Westerns extending that far. So famously, The Shootist takes place at the end of Queen Victoria's reign, and is clearly looking at the death of the Western. So very few of the Western romances that I'm thinking of are set in that time period, in those 60 or 70 years. None of them deal with Native Americans anymore. None of them have that kind of ingrained sexism anymore. There's very little like that. If there's a plot element involving mail order brides, for instance, you know the subversion that will take place. You know it before you even start the book. But cowboys have persisted. Cowboys still have an allure, even if they're contemporary cowboys. In fact, maybe especially if they are contemporary cowboys. One of the things that romances like to do, that romance authors like to do, is find some element of the modern, citified, neutered, technocrat, metrosexual world that is still raw, authentically masculine. Find some element of that world. Find some element in our world that is that, and tap into that energy. The 21st century, again, the blue checkmark Twitter politics say there is no such thing as masculine. That even manhood is a social construct and not a real thing. That's death to romances. So romance authors tend to look for something that still has that residual masculine assumptions and masculine energy. You have a slew of romance novels about bikers, for instance, in biking gangs. Not Lance Armstrong, but biker gangs. You have warrior vampires, 2 or 3 series about warrior vampires. This is the reason for the persistence of Highlander romances. It's an idea that at least here in this little enclave, there are men who are acting unapologetically masculine, unapologetically, aggressively man. And cowboys are a natural candidate for that. So it doesn't matter if you have the female main character is driving a sports car. If she meets a rugged cowboy, there's a lot of cultural assumptions built into that stereotype that romance authors can use. And they do. They do, very much so. The Western equivalent in Western romances of a Highlander would be a bull rider. I don't know how many of you ever watched professional bull riding. It's a sordid type thing, but it's gripping to watch. You really can't look away. It's incredibly anticlimactic. Most of the time, it's incredibly anticlimactic. Famously, the bull rider has to stay on a raging, rampaging bull for 8 seconds. And he's judged according to form and style and whatnot. But there's a real danger involved. There's a real element of danger. One hand is strapped onto the bull. The other hand is used for balance. The hand that's strapped onto the bull can be strapped poorly or too well so that you can't disengage when your ride is clearly over. And on top of that, the bulls are incensed, of course, as you would be too. They are, when you see them being tortured, their gonads have been strapped up in a very painful way. They are stars in their own right. If you go to a professional bull riding match, you can spend all day, you can look at all of your favorites, but the things that sell out in the gift shop are the plushies of the individual bulls. The bulls are stars. Everybody knows their names, everybody knows their stats, everybody knows their personalities, everybody knows the tricks that they have, no two the same, for how they will dispel a rider. And of course, if they dislodge a rider, that's the real danger involved. It's not so much that you'll have, your bones dislocated by bouncing around on this thing. It's that you will fly off the bull and it will get to you before it's distracted. There are rodeo clowns whose job it is in the arena to distract the bull from the fallen rider. And that doesn't always work. Bulls aren't stupid. They know who's been tormenting them. Sometimes that's what they want. They want that more than anything else. They'll look past any number of distractions to get at that person and either horn them up into the air or trample them. And every time you go to a bull riding match, you can see the chance of that happening. Some of it's horrific. Bull riders get injured all the time, sometimes forever. Just their whole life changed in 1 second so that they're in traction for the rest of their life or in serious pain. There is a kind of glory to be had. It's not a glory that I recommend or endorse because it comes at the torture of another living being. But there is a kind of glory that you can get. There are some cash prizes that you can get. And so bull riders are, and it also is, it's indisputably the kind of masculine enclave that I'm talking about. You are literally putting your toughness against a 2,000-pound rampaging animal. So there's that, or you're man enough to wear a plaid kilt in the Scottish Highlands or something like that. So cowboys, especially bull riders, tend to be very popular in romance westerns. But I was wondering yesterday when we were talking about romance westerns whether or not they really count as westerns. There are almost no hallmarks other than that some of the characters are called cowboys and might deal with cattle. And I was thinking that might not be enough. That might not be enough. This is an evolutionary offshoot of the Western, but I don't think it's a Western anymore. Any more than a bird is a theropod dinosaur. It's an offshoot of theropod dinosaurs, but it's not the actual thing anymore. And I thought last night maybe a little more experimentation was in order to find out for sure. We want to be sure about these things, don't we? We don't want to just be flailing all around. So purely in the interest of science, I read a couple more romance westerns. First one is by Alexa Davis, and it's The Hot Cowboy. I took the hit for the purposes of literary inquiry. And this is it's a both the Western romances that I read last night, they didn't take long to read. Obviously, this isn't Schopenhauer, but they both work on the same kind of template. In this one, there's a young man who's only just taking over his family's cattle ranch. He's out of his depth, and he knows it. And the other protagonist, the female protagonist, is a struggling veterinary student who really wants some hands-on experience to prove that she has what it takes. To prove that she can carve out a career here, and that her dreams and her family's dreams are not wasted. They're not misplaced. And the young rancher needs help. He needs a veterinarian if he can get one, and that brings them together. And so it's a kind of mercantile arrangement that ends up working for both of them. And romance blossoms. And it's the same template with the other book that I read purely for experimentation purposes, and that is Saddled and Spurred by Lorelei James, who's written a number of these books, a great number of them. You can see what I mean, right? There's the trappings of cowboys there. There's also the trappings of a Soliflex, which certainly Call and McCrae didn't have. But there's the trappings of a cowboy. I don't think a cowboy would look like that or dress like that. I've known a couple of them, and they didn't. But this is very much the same thing. This is a cattle rancher who needs hands, who needs workers, and there just aren't enough of them. So the former belle of the ball, the former debutante queen of the town, wants to prove that she is not just a porcelain doll. She signs up for the work. He takes her because he has really no choice. And once they're thrown into proximity, sparks start to fly. And I have to say, the Lorelei James book was much better than the, who was it again? Alexa Davis. You can tell, Lorelei James has been writing these a lot. She's written a lot of these books. And you can tell that she knows what she's doing in a way that I didn't get with Alexa Davis. That there were holes in the Alexa Davis story that I wasn't looking for. I wasn't looking for them at all. I was just looking to be entertained. But I was still, there were times, especially towards the end of the book, where I was thinking, okay, but you weren't leading up to that, and that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's a huge leap. And there wasn't anything like that in this book. I should, in the purposes of fairness, point out, again, from a purely forensic, scientific point of view, that the hunky cowboy here, the rancher, is neither saddled nor spurred in the course of this book. Purely for the purposes of literary accountability, I was looking. But in this kind of template, the template for both of these books, there is a moment when things tip over, when things change from the arrangement that starts the book to both characters realizing that there's more going on here now. Now, the tension, the way that good authors tend to keep these novels going, keep you turning the pages, Lorelei James does it perfectly, is for that moment not to happen at the same time. Right? For one of the two to realize it before the other one does. And then you get the pleasure of that moment coming in the climax of the book. In the 1,000-old Regency romance, the Signet Regency romances that I love so much, that moment is always the highlight of the novel. And in those Regency romances, that moment always comes about in a moment of physical danger. The cad, the dark horse cousin, the outlaw, the bandit of one kind or another, the pirate, is always threatening either the male lead or the female lead or both when they both realize they are indispensable to each other. That's the way it almost always happens in those novels. In modern contemporary romances, even contemporary Regency romances, it tends not to be that way. In the Lorelei James book, it isn't that way. And the point that I'm making is that I love that moment. You would, as an author, you would have to write a really, really bad version of that for me not to love that moment. I tend to love it. And I liked it very much in the Lorelei James book, which I read just to figure this out. That's all. Forensically. I just wanted to figure this out. And I think now that I am, even by my own standards of self-indulgence, I think that I am now done with this experiment. With figuring out, I'm pretty sure now that Western romances don't count as actual, Western romances don't count as actual Westerns. So I'm going to finish out June on the Range. June on the Range has a few more days left. I'm going to finish out June on the Range with more traditional Westerns. I've got a bunch of them, more than I could read in the next week if that was all I read. And it isn't all I have to read. I have a lot of other things to read. But I'm going to finish out with traditional stuff like that. I'm going to resist the urge to go back to authors that I've encountered in the course of June on the Range and liked. I'm not going to go back to Louis L'Amour. I'm not going to go back to Elmer Kelton or Joe Gorman or anything else. I'm going to find other authors and read them for the rest of the week. So the next progress report that I have, you'll be the first to know. I would say, under ordinary circumstances, since I think this filming arrangement works, we'll have to see what the audio is like. The air conditioner is humming in the background. I'm assuming that you can hear every word I'm saying. I mean, I'm assuming it's not that loud, but I never know. But otherwise, it works. There are no interruptions. No power equipment is audible in these videos. So I'm thinking that videos work. So you would think in the normal course of things, if videos work and you're going to read other Westerns for June on the Range, that you'll have an update tomorrow. But I might not have an update tomorrow. I might not. And it won't be because of work. It'll be because one of you sent me this. The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel in a Canadian trade paperback with deckled edges and the French flaps there. And this one has the deckled edges. Not only are they lovely, but they're worn. This thing has been used. Someone read this already. And when I got the second volume in this series, probably from the same sender, Bring Up the Bodies, I thought, well, no reason to read it right away. And I caved in less than a minute. I caved by that night. So it's entirely possible that tomorrow I will not have any Westerns to comment on because I will have given all my reading time over to Hilary Mantel, to her story of Thomas Cromwell. I'm going to try not to. I'm going to try to keep myself to 20 pages a day at most. At most. That should still leave plenty of reading time. So tonight, Felix Frankfurter, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter gets a lot of my time tonight. But there should still be time for Westerns. If there are, I will make another update. Of course, I'm not going to just peter out of June on the Range. We'll go out shooting. But I'm hoping it'll be tomorrow. We'll see. I'll see what these videos sound like when they're uploaded. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.